Welcome to the December Chicago Foodways Roundtable program. Okay, so our program tonight is the story of Chicago's South Asians and their food with Colleen Taylor Sen. She's been here a number of times over the years. We've gone to restaurants with her. We've gone on street walks with her. Um, so we've been very engaged for 20, 30 years. She's presented many programs, as I indicated. She's a prolific author and editor. She's contributed freelance articles to such publications as Travel and Leisure, the Chicago Sun-Times, the Chicago Tribune, and has been a regular participant at the Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery. She's written 8 books. Among them is Food Culture in India, Curry, A Global History, and Feasts and Fasts, A History of Food in India. She also wrote a book that isn't on this list at the moment, but it's a book for Americans on how to order Indian food and get off the beaten path of things that people kind of order because they're comfortable with it, but they don't necessarily go beyond that. And that's why we're going to be having occasional dinners with Colleen and try to order those foods that Americans tend not to try. So, Colleen, I'm turning this over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine. It's really a pleasure and honor to be talking to Chicago Foodways again. I'm going to talk, this is something I've been researching for, 30 or 40 years. I just keep accumulating material. And I gave this talk a few weeks ago at a library. And even since then, I've revised it and updated it. The banner you see, A History of Indians and Their Food in Chicago, this came from a publication called The Clarion, which was a supplement to the Reader. I think I did it in April 2022, and Peter Engler and I think Catherine as well were responsible for me contributing this my article to this publication, which really was very interesting. So that's where the banner comes from. So some of that material would be in this talk today, but there's also other things I'll be talking about. Now, I'm not going to go into details about this. This is something I've been working on for another book, but the whole immigration policy of the United States towards Indians has just been, it's been very interesting and very complex. In the 18th and 19th century, there were no real legal restrictions. And actually, as I always mention, and people are surprised, the first Indians, and by that I mean South Asians, came to America in the 1670s. They came as one of the ships that landed in Jamestown. And the reason was that the British Englishmen who had made their pile in India with the East India Company, they would buy land in the New World. And the more people in their entourage, the more land they could buy. And many of them had Indian servants, even slaves on occasion, that they had brought from India. So they brought these people over with them. And this went on for quite a while. And at one time, there were more South Asians in Chesapeake Bay than there were Native Americans. We don't have an exact count, but eventually they disappeared. They really intermarried with different groups, and there really is no trace of them, although their DNA studies have shown traces of South Asian ancestry in certain groups. I won't go into that. I have to look at that more. So there were no real restrictions on Indians coming, on South Asians coming. Some people would come with ships. They would jump ship. That was a fairly common thing on the East Coast. But eventually, there was. And then in the around the turn of the century, there were a lot of people from the Punjab, mainly Sikhs, who came to Canada and to America to work in the lumber and the lumber industry and in the mills. And at first they were welcomed because they were very hardworking. They were, they were fairly reasonably priced and they were welcome. But then Euro-Americans, as they are called, began to unionize, and there was a feeling that they were being undercut. So there was a lot more public pressure, and the immigration laws became a lot more restrictive. And in 1908, they started banning South Asian immigrants. In 1913, what happened as the as these mainly Sikhs and other Punjabis were driven down the coast, they went to California where they worked as agricultural laborers. And being, thrifty and knowing how to farm, they started buying land, especially in the Imperial Valley. But what happened, again, this caused tensions. The Alien Land Act barred non-citizens from owning land, and there was subsequent legislation, including a 1923 Supreme Court decision that legally barred Indians from becoming U.S. citizens and revoked citizenship from many who attained it, and then immigration was banned entirely. Now, an interesting twist of this is that they also imposed similar restrictions on Japanese and Chinese. But the difference was the Japanese and Chinese had a government behind them that supported them and often kind of fought some of these measures that were being passed. So they had a little bit of clout. Indians were under the control of the British. The British government really had no interest in helping them. There was also an kind of the beginning of a pro-independence movement among the Indians in America, as there was also in South Africa. So the Brits really didn't want a lot of Indians going to America and stirring up trouble because they had their own newspapers and things like that. So, but this eventually changed in 1946 because Indians had been very active in World War II, supporting the Allies. So the Luce-Seller Act, and Luce actually was Clare Booth Luce, who was really was married to the owner of Time and really was a great advocate for Indians and even for Indian independence then. And there was a small quota limited, a set of 100 immigrants from India. In 1965, the big Immigration Act, Nationality Act, was signed by President Johnson. It abolished all these restrictions and gave preference to immigrants with needed skills or who were related to U.S. citizens. And that's when the big wave of people from South Asia, from India and Pakistan, started coming to the U.S. And then in 1989, the H-1B visa was introduced to facilitate entry of professionals. And 3/4 of the people who got these H-1B visas were Indian. And also, of course, in Silicon Valley, there's a large South Asian population, and so many of the companies now are run by South Asians. That's just a little summary that gives you an idea what the situation was. Now, in Chicago, we don't really know. I don't know exactly when the first Indians came to Chicago, because the 1870 census lists 8 people from India, but they could have been British people coming from British India, so it was hard to tell. And their number rose very gradually and to 176 by 1930, but then they abolished the category of Indians, and they were kind of lumped in with other Asians. So until 1970, it was very hard to know exactly how many there were. As of 2024, there are around 2.25 South Asians in the Chicago area, and you can see how dramatically this has increased since 1980. Indians are nearly 82%, Pakistanis 15%, and so on. And originally, we all know that Devon Avenue was the great Little India, as it was sometimes called, and that was originally one of the ports of entry, as they call them, for Indians, because the housing was fairly inexpensive and things like that. But lately there's been a movement of people from the city to the suburbs, especially the northwest and the far west suburbs. And if you can see this, the lower part of these bars is people in Chicago, and the upper is the suburbs, and you can see how it's dramatically increased. And of course, this has meant that a lot of the restaurants are now, many restaurants in the suburbs. Patel Brothers has expanded into Arlington Heights and Naperville. And so Devon Avenue isn't the mecca so much as it used to be for people to come and shop. So the first Indians really that we know about in Chicago were Indian students, and these were mainly at the University of Chicago. And this is a picture of some in 1911. And what was interesting is the Chicago Tribune in 1920 said that Indian students here had formed a cricket team. And apparently, University of Chicago had a cricket team, which to me is an amazing thing. I guess other universities, Harvard and things, must have had them as well. And this is a fellow named Chandra Gunaratne. He was actually from Ceylon, Sri Lanka now, but he was captain. He was captain of the University of Chicago polo team. So University of Chicago also had a polo team, which is extremely interesting. And he probably came from, and there were some students from very affluent backgrounds. Mr. Gunaratne must have been because he had his own polo pony. I think the son of the Maharaja of Baroda studied maybe at Harvard. Rabindranath Tagore's son studied at University of Illinois, Urbana. So this was pretty much people from the elite who originally came and studied here. But some students perhaps were not from such elite backgrounds. And those who were on scholarship, first of all, they were on tight rations. And secondly, they faced quite a bit of discrimination. And they were restricted as to where they could live. Some boarding houses and didn't want to take them. Even at some universities, they couldn't use the cafeteria. And in Chicago, they tended to live mainly on the south side. And I believe they lived to some degree with the African American community, and I'll come back to that later because I think that's an interesting issue that that needs to be looked at. So since I'm talking about food, I did find a couple of articles about what these students ate. And one article in 1908 said one student's daily diet in Chicago consisted of grain crackers, fruit, nuts, breakfast food, and eggs. And another lived exclusively on bread and beans and added different sauces to the beans. Um, there were a couple of other groups that also came, not necessarily to Chicago. There were the Sikhs and who on the West Coast. There were communities of peddlers who settled in New Orleans and New York. And some of these eventually joined the Great Migration North of African Americans. And especially during World War I, they were looking for people. So they came to work in the factories and steel mills. And there were boarding houses and restaurants for India in the African American communities in Cleveland, Detroit, and other northern cities. And they must have been in Chicago's South Side as well. And that's something I need to go into some archives and find out. In 1917, the Chicago Tribune reported that several Indians who worked in a steel mill in Gary were arrested by Chicago and federal police in connection with a plot in India to inflame Indians with revolt against British rule. Some of these students became fairly militant and published a newspaper. They had a group called the Khadar Society. And so this is something the British didn't like, which is another reason they worked with the Americans to eliminate these people. And apparently Americans totally forgot that they had rebelled against the British themselves, 140 odd years ago. Something that's very interesting, and this goes back to a program that Catherine did, I think last year on a couple of pioneering food writers, and one was Jane Eddington. Now, there wasn't that much writing about Indian food in the American press. People really didn't know anything about India. It wasn't part of their history the way it was with Britain. But she played quite a role in trying to introduce people to Indian food. And she was the Chicago Tribune's food columnist from 1910 to 1930, and also one of the country's first full-time food writers. And her daily syndicated column, the Tribune Cookbook, was in many ways ahead of its time. So she had recipes for vegetarian meals, for ingredients like tamarind, avocado, okra, papayas, and eggplants that really weren't well known at the time. And she also wrote a lot about curries. She wrote at least eight columns about curries. And she first encountered curry during a trip to Britain. So her approach was very much that of of what the British viewed as curry. But despite that, her recipes were fairly authentic. The way she described how to make a curry, she's told housewives that curries were very useful because it's easy to make and it was very suitable for the use of leftovers, which is true. And she always said that you should not buy ready-made curry powders, you should make your own. And this is a recipe she gave. And this recipe really is very interesting. And I don't know where one would even get the spices at that time because there weren't that many, there certainly were no Indian stores. And I think there were maybe a couple of stores that imported spices. So this was a recipe that appeared in 1924. And I just think that's very interesting that she would do that. Now, the first restaurant in Chicago, this is something I learned recently. I was talking to Ahmed Akbar, who is the food writer for the Tribune. He did a piece a while ago on Indian food in Chicago. And I learned from him that the first Indian restaurant in Chicago was not what I thought, but it was something called the Hindustan. And it was located I think it was on 139th Street. I have the address somewhere. I must have. Oh, and in any case, I don't have it here. I did find the site on Google Street Maps, but it just looks like it's a vacant lot. But it was in the far south. And this notice of the Hindustan, this actually appeared in the Chicago Defender, which of course is an African American newspaper. And it supplanted a recipe called the Libya. And this appeared in a couple of African American papers, and it notes that the genial and affable proprietor was Prince Ranji Smile, and he's going to have a restaurant and a garden, and he engaged Wilfred Bain, and he's a member of the Manhattan Newspapermen's Association to publicize his place, and that actually is an African American newspaper association. But this guy is so interesting. There's been so much written about him. I think I take credit. I think I was the first person to write an article on him for Food Arts years ago. But since then, there's been a lot of article. And he really was, well, he claimed he was a prince. He told all kinds of stories about himself. He said he was the son of the Emir of Afghanistan and that he was friends with King Edward VII and that he was, he had all these aristocratic connections. He was discovered by a famous restaurant owner named Sherry, who brought him from London, where he was working in a London restaurant, to be a chef at his restaurant in Fifth Avenue. And he became an overnight celebrity. And he really was the first of what we now call the bad boy chefs. First of all, he liked women and women liked him. A story in Harper's Bazaar said, "A chef from India, women go wild for him." He was married 4 or 5 times. He kept remarrying. He would bring people over from India to work in his restaurant. He said they were his staff from his palace, but they were illegal immigrants and they were deported. Then he lost his job at Sherry's. He worked at a series of lesser and lesser restaurants. He became engaged in drunken brawls. He got in a lot of fights, and he was always in the news. I mean, the New York Times had a lot of articles about him. So we don't know I didn't know what happened to him, but then all of a sudden in 1919 or so, he turns up in Chicago. So I thought, well, this is interesting. I have to read more about him. So I looked at the directories, and the only phone directory they had after 1919 was in 1923. But in 1923, I looked, there was no mention of this restaurant, no mention of Ranji Smile. So I suppose he must have gone back to India. But this is such an interesting story. And as I said, something I just learned about recently. Now, restaurant owners are a very picturesque lot, and I think Chicago had others. And another restaurant that was, I think, the first Indian restaurant after the Hindustan was the House of India, which opened in 1963, first at 2048 North Lincoln and later at 1746 North Wells. And the owner, who called himself Colonel Abdullah, he claims to have been an officer in the Indian Army and to hold a PhD in psychology from Oxford University, which is not something they offer. But he actually was from Tallahassee, Florida. He was an African American. One of these waiters, he hired waiters, wearing turbans and things. And they were mainly Indian students, and one was a friend of ours. And he served in the American Army in Calcutta during the war, and he started calling himself Colonel Abdullah and opened this restaurant. Now, the menu and decor were aimed at a Western audience. You have to realize at that time, people's knowledge of India in America was pretty much limited to the stories of Kipling and movies like, Bengal Lancers with Gary Cooper. So the decor of some of these early restaurants in the 60s, and this was true elsewhere in the US, was very kind of British oriented. They would have pictures of hunting scenes and things like that. And the food had a lot of curries. And you don't find the word curry on Indian restaurant menus so much. Occasionally you do, but not like you did at that time. And so a typical menu in 1968, the Tribune wrote about, it had rice, it had lamb corna with pineapple, which I've never had, a vegetarian curry, a sirloin of beef curry, a hot spice dish, which the reporter noted was called pork vindaloo, and papadums prepared only for special parties. And of course, now many meals in Indian restaurants begin with these papadums. But the restaurant, eventually it kind of, I don't know what happened, it didn't do well, and it closed down in 1973. Now, in the 1960s, though, Colonel Abdul opened another restaurant, and this was a restaurant with a jazz club called the Taj Mahal, and it was at 1321 South Michigan. And it featured Bombay martinis and the curries of India, served by a costume East Indian staff. And one of the performers, and may also be an owner, was a famous jazz musician, Ahmad Jamal. And so you see, this is kind of another connection of India with the African American community and the South Side. Now, just take a look at this. I'm going to talk about some of these places. This is a list I put together of the history of Chicago's Indian restaurants. If anyone, I don't think you'll have, maybe if anyone has any input, I'd really appreciate it if you can either put it on the chat room, or you can even contact me, because this is just a list that I've been putting together over the years, and I'll refer back to it later. So, okay, so before I talk more about the new wave of restaurants, I have to talk about the current sort of the evolution of the Indian restaurant tradition. Now, in India itself, in the subcontinent, let's call it that, there wasn't a restaurant tradition. There were street food stalls, there were little kind of cafe-like places. The British, when they came, they had restaurants in hotels that served continental food. And it was really only after independence in 1947, when in the subcontinent split into India and Pakistan, and there was a great exchange of population, that you had refugees from Pakistan who came, and they opened stalls, first of all. And one of the most famous of these was a restaurant called Moti Mahal. And this is a picture I took years ago for an article I did. This is a fellow named Kundan Lal Gujral, and he's considered the inventor of tandoori chicken, although there's a dispute going on. There's a big lawsuit in India that he owned it, but one of his cooks, also named Kundan Lal, invented tandoori chicken. So this is kind of an interesting thing. But in any case, that's a picture I took of him. You can see he's another of these very flamboyant restaurateurs. So there really was no Indian restaurant tradition, so they kind of had to invent one. And one of the dishes, of course, was tandoori chicken. Now, Kundan Lal came from Peshawar in Pakistan, which is now in Pakistan. In northern India and what became Pakistan, there was a tradition of cooking in tandoors, which are clay ovens. There really wasn't that much of a tradition in the rest of India. But in any case, he had one built somehow by a fellow Peshwari. And he took the recipe, which was chicken marinated in yogurt, and he added spices and a red dye to it. This became very popular. It was discovered by Nehru. And then he opened this restaurant, Moti Mahal, which was really the first kind of, I would say, upscale restaurant serving Indian food. And it became very popular. And later he invented butter chicken. The story is using leftover chicken, and some chef in Scotland apparently invented chicken tikka masala, but these all are come out of this tandoori chicken. Um, there was another strain, another group of people from Punjab, and their food, which was based on, I would say, seasonal vegetables, chicken and goat, and you have dishes like aloo matar paneer, palak paneer, and so on that you find in restaurants today. And you also have a lot of meat dishes that came from the North Indian Pakistani Muslim tradition. And these are things like biryani and kebabs and Rogan Josh and dishes like that. So all of these things kind of, these different trends came and were incorporated in what became kind of the standard Indian restaurant menu, I would say, in North America. Now, these meat dishes I mentioned, these North Indian Pakistani Muslim dishes, they came under the name Mughal. Now, they really had very little to do with the Mughals. The Mughals were a dynasty that ruled India from about 1506 to 1857. They're, but well, we know what they ate. Some of these dishes they ate, but basically, this term was basically invented by restaurant owners to give some cachet to their food. Because if you look at a Google Ngram, which I should have showed it. I think I've showed it another talk. You can see that this term Mughal cuisine really wasn't in use until, in a big way, until the early 50s. And this engram measures mentions in magazines and newspapers. So all of a sudden, people started calling this Mughal food, but kind of it's a short form for a certain type of cuisine. So that's kind of in a nutshell what it is. Now, this is something I learned just recently. Last week I got together, met some friends, and it turned out that I don't know why this picture in the bottom keeps flipping. I've changed it several times. I'm sorry. Um, so they had a restaurant called Gandhara, and it was from about 1981 to 1983. And it was really one of the first, I would say, upscale restaurants in Chicago. And they served this kind of food, which they called Mughal cuisine, but they explained that it was North Indian Pakistan, and the decor was British colonial. The menu followed a Western pattern with soup, appetizers, side dishes, main courses, desserts, which really isn't the way an Indian meal progresses, but most restaurants have adopted that to adapt to Western tastes. And many of the dishes, in fact, almost all the dishes on their menu, which was what, 40 years ago, today can be found on Indian restaurant menus. So they were kind of pioneers in that sense. Now, what I found interesting is if you look at the reviews of these restaurants, this was all kind of new to reviewers. They didn't really know what Indian food was about. So I think that, so the Mark Knobloch, writing in the 1983 Tribune, says, exciting Gandhara expands India's one-note cuisine. Well, I don't know what he meant by one-note cuisine, but that was what he said. And he had to explain the dishes. He said there were appetizers that looked like deep-fried timbales. The pakoras looked like American fritters. But instead of pouring on ketchup, you sauce them with one or both of the chutneys. And you're not supposed to pour the sauce on the pakoras. You're supposed to, they're dipping sauces. And then he says that unlike other Far Eastern cuisines, Indian cooking has failed to produce really superior desserts. So he's kind of lumping together Indian, Chinese, and Japanese. And again, this is just people really weren't familiar with what Indian cuisine was at that stage, and we can see that in other things as well. Now, I kind of skipped. I'm sorry. I wanted to go back to 1963. I kind of skipped over that. Um, I'm sorry. Hold on. Oh, okay. So let me go back to my list of restaurants. Okay. So in 1969, another restaurant opened called Bengal Lancers, and that was 2200 block of North Clark. And it was opened by a guy, Mohan Shablani, and he was a PR guy. And again, he was one of these very flamboyant places. And Bengal Lancers, again, it had this theme of, the British Raj. They had Pim's Cup and things like that. And it was in an old mansion at 2200 block of North Clark. And it featured such items as Colonel Skinner's curry chicken. And to a possible charge that his restaurant was not authentic, he claimed in a 1979 article in the Chicago Tribune, an authentic Indian restaurant would have 2 cows. People would sit on the floor eating with their hands, and I would have to find 16 flies, which is just ridiculous. So that's gave quite a misleading picture. Uh, to go down a little bit, in 1975, the first Tasty, which was the first Pakistani restaurant that called itself Pakistani, opened. It lasted a few years. By 1977, there were at least 10 Indian restaurants in Chicago. And in 1981 to 85, we had, again, as I mentioned, Bombay Palace, Samrat and Gandhara. Then Bukhara, a few more interests. In 1993, Udupi Palace, which was the first South Indian restaurant that served South Indian vegetarian food, opened. There was another one, Woodlands, but it closed a few years ago. And then there's a few more of these restaurants that I'll talk about later. Now I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk about Devon Avenue, since it's what's really been associated with the Indian food. And this is a long street, 20 miles it stretches. It was originally settled in the 1850s. It was kind of a farming area. There were greenhouses there. There are two explanations of the name. One is that it comes from people from Devon in England, and the other is that it was a stop on the Philadelphia main line. I don't know why that would be. The streetcars led to the beginning of residential housing. After World War II, young Jewish families moved from Lawndale and Albany Park. And in the early 1960s, it was still a major Jewish shopping area. But the Jewish population eventually moved west and north to Skokie to Highland Park. And as I mentioned earlier, immigration laws were reformed in 1965, and that's when it became more of a South Asian community because it was affordable, it was accessible. And Devon Avenue was already a well-developed retail area. Rents were affordable. Some Indians, especially Gujaratis, are known as being entrepreneurs. For example, the Patel brothers, who opened their first store in 1974. By 1990, there were more than 150 Indian, and I should say Pakistani-owned stores in Devon between California and Western. It became a shopping mecca for the Midwest, but as I mentioned, Indians have increasingly been moving to the suburbs. Now, when it comes to grocery stores, the first one actually was 1967, and a man named Sarjan Singh Sikand opened a small grocery store at 2911 North Broadway. Now, until that time, there were few Indians that were here. The only place you could get your spices was a store on Roosevelt called Conte di Savoia. He started importing Italian things. Then eventually he branched out into other places. And Mr. Sikand, who actually I interviewed before he died, he was selling lentils to the owner of Conte di Savoia. Then he got the idea he might as well start importing them himself. So he actually opened this grocery store. Later he moved to Broadway in Belmont, and later he opened a little restaurant called Moti Mahal that was actually on Belmont. Here's the Patel brothers in the lower right. I ran into them a couple of weeks ago, and I thought this is my chance to get a picture with Tulsi and Muffet, who are worth hundreds of millions of dollars. We were at an event, and they opened their first store. Their first store was at 2034 Devon at Damon. Actually, it was for Tulsi Bai's wife to work there. Then they expanded to their other store at 2610, which is now their flagship store. And now it's the center of multi-million, 100 million retail and manufacturing empire. They manufacture things, they import them. And today, actually, Indian products, you can find them in mainstream supermarkets as well. You can find them in places like Trader Joe's and Jewel and everywhere, actually. So it's not, and a lot of frozen things as well. One thing in Patel Brothers, at first they didn't, they themselves are vegetarians, as people from that part of India often are. They didn't sell meat. They don't have fresh meat, but they do sell frozen meat products, and I'm surprised they even sell frozen beef products now, which is something fairly new. Next to it, actually, you can see Annapurna, which is a little restaurant they own, which is a vegetarian restaurant. I think there's 4 vegetarian restaurants left on Devon now, if anyone is interested in that. Now, immigration patterns keep changing. Immigration of Muslims have increased from India, especially Hyderabad, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. And these people have been opening their own restaurants, grocery stores, butcher shops, and bakeries. The butcher shops, the meat has to be both halal and zabiha. Halal meaning it's not a forbidden meat like pork, and zabiha means it's ritually slaughtered in the correct way. There are mosques and several prayer rooms in on or near Devon. And restaurants advertise Indian Pakistani cuisine. Some call themselves Indo-Pak. Basically, the cuisine is the same. I mean, North Indian meat cuisine is very similar. There would be a few differences, but basically it's a gradation. All cuisines are a gradation. More recently, I've noticed that Middle Eastern stores and restaurants have opened in the area, and there were a couple of Afghan bakeries, and Afghans are famous for their bakeries, but I think one of them is just closed, unfortunately. But there's another one near California that I was at recently. Now, I mentioned that the Jewish presence declined along Devon, but there were a lot of there are and were a lot of synagogues on California, and because Orthodox Jews have to walk to the synagogue on the Sabbath, there's been a resurgence of the Jewish population in our neighborhood, especially of Haredim, Orthodox Jews. So that's led to a little bit of a resurgence of um, of Jewish stores, although there's not really as many as you'd expect. And these are a couple of pictures in Devon, and you can see that the store Camp Al Jalani Grocery is actually an Assyrian, people from Syria and Iraq, and that's your script. But you can see this is Golda Meir Boulevard. I think that's because a lot of the streets have been renamed. In fact, there's an intersection of Golda Meir and Mother Teresa streets at that point. And once I gave a talk at a conference, and there was an Israeli in the audience, and when I said that, he said, "Aren't they the same person?" Which I thought was very funny. So, so Devon Avenue is continuing to change. Now, there's a lot of and this is kind of a summary of what kind of Indian restaurants are in Chicago today. And this will take a bit of time. So first of all, you have the standard Punjabi Mughlai cuisine I mentioned. Butter chicken, samosas, sag paneer, chicken tikka masala naan. And this is what people order. I mean, this is what the average person, the average American goes in and order. But I don't want to be critical because I was thinking the other day, when I go to a Thai restaurant, I know nothing about Thai food. I order the same things. So, I mean, I don't, unless there's kind of an educational process going on, it's hard to really expand your knowledge. And that's why I'm putting together this little group, well, not a little group, but we're trying to sample different ethnic foods. You have the South Indian vegetarian restaurants. You have a few Gujarati restaurants that serve Gujarati vegetarian food. You have a Hyderabadi. Now, Hyderabad is a city in South India. It has a large Muslim population, and they're very famous for their food. They're famous for their biryani. Hyderabadi biryani, I think it has what you call a geographical designation. And there's quite a few Hyderabadi restaurants on Devon. The one that I like is off Devon on California called Hyderabadi Kitchen. I've taken people there and everyone likes it. They have dishes like halim, which is kind of it's beaten grain and lentils with meat. They have paratha, different kinds of kebabs. And this is a food that people aren't used to, but is really very good. There's a type of restaurant called a dhaba, and dhaba is a more simple restaurant. You find these scattered around the city, and these are places where taxi drivers hang out, not just from the subcontinent, but also from Africa. Hyderabad House on the south side of Devon, that's kind of a taxi driver hangout. There's a picture at the top here. They often have the menu posted on a blackboard, and they have a few items. Dhaba is a word borrowed from India, where you have stops along highways that originally service, truck drivers, but now they become fashionable among urban foodies. Um, and you have what I call ethnic restaurants, which means they're not mainstream restaurants. They're not South Indian, they're not North Indian, they're not Hyderabadi. You have things like food from Kerala, which is a small state in Southeast India, Southwest India, which is very distinctive cuisine, big on seafood, a lot of coconut milk. And Tatu has got all kinds of awards. I mean, it was featured as one of the top restaurants in the New York Times. There's another one, there's one in Des Plaines, and there's one opening on Devon Avenue soon. You have Gujarati restaurants, you have Eggaholic, and I noticed that Cynthia Clampett's here, and she pointed out to me that Eggaholic is now a nationwide chain, and they serve it's kind of a distinctive Gujarati street food that has really unusual egg dishes. I've only been to it once. You have sweet and snack shops. Now, Indians love to snack. They like to eat sweets, and you have Sukaria, which is on Devon at the corner of Devon and Rockwell. It's really good. You have Tahur, which is down the block, and there's other places too. And these places are packed on the weekends with people going and just snacking and having tea and things like that. You have a kind of a cuisine called Chinese Indian, or Chindian, it's sometimes called, and this is kind of a unique combination. It developed in Calcutta. There was a large Chinese population in Calcutta at one time, dating back to the 19th century. Most have emigrated, but it's kind of they have red sauces. They have dishes like chicken Manchuria, gobi Manchuria, chicken 65. It can be quite spicy. There's one on Devon. It's across from Usmania. It's Usmania Chinese, but there's some nice ones in the suburbs too. And Indians love this kind of cuisine. Oh, chicken corn soup is another one. There's a kind of soup called Hakka noodle soup. So it's got some very distinct dishes. And finally, we have the latest, which is called progressive cuisine. The word fusion really isn't used anymore much. This is the first in Chicago. There was Mango Pickle, which is closed. It was on Broadway. You had Rue, and now you have Andien. Andien is the first Indian restaurant in Chicago to gain a Michelin star. And you have these restaurants in New York City. You have some on the West Coast, San Francisco, and the chefs trained at really famous European restaurants like Noma in Copenhagen, like Al Bulli. And one definition of this is traditional flavors in new combinations and presentations for a global audience. So it's not just combining ingredients willy-nilly, let's get a steak and put spices on it. It's more sophisticated than that. So these are a couple of examples. Here's one, an asparagus and coconut stew with turmeric and coconut idiyappam. Idiyappam is a Kerala kind of bread, spongy bread. And this is a dish, egg curry, a little lamb chop, yogurt chat, and you can see the pretty little, what do you call it, like grill-like thing. They will often use Indian ingredients like millets and jackfruit with Western techniques. So you may have tacos made from millet flour. They have tasting menus, which wasn't really something part of India. And you have small plates, attractive presentation. And one thing they have is innovative cocktail pairings. And it's my my firm belief that the best drink to go with an Indian meal is a cocktail, a well-matched cocktail. Now, these restaurants, they didn't come out of nowhere. This really started in India, especially in Mumbai. Mumbai has a great restaurant culture. And again, you have this interplay of chefs kind of, going back and forth. I know there's been Indian chefs came to Alinea. So it's really part of kind of the internationalization of cuisine. This is just a couple of menus I just picked. This is a restaurant from Andian, and you can see buckwheat tart, for example, yogurt and egg curry. It's a very nice thing. And this is a restaurant in Mumbai. And again, it's just the ingredients that they list, like you would find at a restaurant here. And they have wine pairings and cocktail pairings. So that's kind of a overview. I really kind of went here and there. Um, this is a listing of my books. I gave a talk a year or two ago in this Bloomsbury Handbook of Indian Cuisine, but by then there was only an academic version, and it was really expensive. I didn't want anyone to buy it, but now there is a paperback version that it's still kind of pricey, but you might be able to get a cheaper version on AB Books. It's just an encyclopedia. We had 25 contributors mainly from India, and entries and all kinds of things like states and ingredients. So in any case, that kind of is my quick overview, and I really would welcome questions because there's a lot of things I'm sure you would like to know more about.
Do you mind, Colleen, commenting about your recent trip to Detroit?
Oh yeah, there's an exhibit on at the Detroit Art Institute on food in the Islamic world. And I drove up with friends. It's really was quite a hike, but it was really very interesting. And they had things like paintings, they had cooking utensils, they had a pot that belonged to one of the Mughal emperors. They had menus, and it was really, if you're interested in especially Islamic art and cooking, it's really worth a visit. They have a gorgeous book that illustrated it, that accompanied it with essays by all kinds of leading scholars. The exhibit originally came from the LA Museum of Art, but I think it ends like January 5th or 6th or so.
Yeah, I checked on that, and you're right. That's about when it ends. And you were lucky to get there and back in one day and not get stuck in some snow.
I know that was a big fear.
So there's a bunch of different thoughts and comments. I'll just start there. Jeffrey said, I moved to Chicago in 1980. Back then, there was a store on the west side of Clark between Newport and Roscoe that sold Indian spices from bulk containers. He says, I can't recall the name, and the building was demolished in the CTA's, I guess, whatever, RPM project.
What was it
So
called?
some
Indian spices from what?
he doesn't remember the name.
Oh,
They
Indian
were
spices.
sold in bulk. It was on Clark between Newport and Roscoe.
Okay, thank you.
Hmm. Um, then Jose Aram, he said there are a lot of halal stores in southeast Cook County. The Costco in Bedford Park is just off of Cicero, offers a large variety of halal meats and products. This is one of those rare, it's not your like general merchandise. I don't know if you've been there, but general merchandise Costco, there's a lot of bulk foods. Like you could buy 25 or I think 50-pound bags of beans and things like that. Or you could buy a whole lamb. I know you could buy a whole lamb at other Costco's, but that one's, kind of unique. Peter Engler commented, he says, I believe Ahmad Jamal owned a short-lived nightclub, no alcohol, at Alhambra that predated Taj Mahal at that South Michigan address. You could see the exterior on the cover of Ahmad Jamal's album, 1961, or is it 67? Oh, maybe 61 question mark of the same name. Alhambra served South Asian and other halal food. Ebony magazine ran a long story with photos of the interior and a discussion of the food, which he said was a fascinating article.
Oh, wow, that's great. I'll follow up with Peter.
Don't worry, everything that's in the chat. Colleen, I will send you a
Oh,
copy.
okay.
Dan commented, I've seen Indo-Chinese often used to describe Chinese influenced Indian dishes. Is Chindian a term only used in Chicago for this cuisine, or does it refer to something else?
No, no, that's an Indian term. That's something used in Indian. I don't think I've ever seen it here. We just, I probably even should put it in. No, Chinese Indian is just fine. Yeah.
Um,
Indo-Chinese tends to imply Indochina sometimes means like Vietnam and places like that.
um, Golfin inquired, what are the foods in the photo entitled "Thank you" questions? So it's the one you have right now in front of us.
Oh, well, those are spices on the left. I think piles of chili and probably turmeric. Right in front, gosh, I don't know. It looks like ginger or something, or maybe that's turmeric. And then I think there's different kinds of grains in the side, lentils, various kinds of lentils and grains.
Okay, by the way, Steve clarified that RPM was red, purple mainline L.
Oh.
I had no idea. Hey, Scott Warner's here today. What was the quality of the Indian food in the earlier Chicago restaurants? It seems, as I recall, that years ago the food was, well, not so great. So different from today? Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think so. I mean what we have now, I don't want to use the word authentic. That's a bad word in the food world, but you know, you have these you know, all these wonderful Hyderabadi restaurants, you have these Gujarati restaurants. I mean, this is what the kind of food that people actually eat. And then you have you know, the more fancy places that serve. So I think I mean, probably the food's a lot better. I don't think that, you know, these restaurants in the 60s. I mean, I dined at House of Colonel Abdus' place, but I really can't remember it very much. So I think the food is definitely improved.
You know, I've learned of Devon Avenue in a roundabout way. I was in Moscow, USSR, and I had Indian neighbors across the hall from me who had a daughter in Chicago. And they said, well, when we get together, let's go to Devon Avenue. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I didn't know anything. And I had relatives living in the area. Um, but at one point, now going back to Moscow, they actually did have a few Indian restaurants. This was in the, I would say, in the Perestroika era. And there was one where they imported ingredients, but all the food had a one note to it. And it turned out, yeah, they were importing ingredients, and the people in the restaurant were selling it out the back door to Indian nationals. So you didn't get much of a varied cuisine like you would. Um, Jose said one driver of the Indian food industry since the 1990s is the fact that most Indian women work, and he says in parentheses, my observation, I used to love to shop there.
Oh, there's so many convenience foods. I mean, 30 years now, there's everything. You have like dosa mixes. You don't even have to mix it. You just buy a thing and you pour it on the pan. There's frozen breads. I don't think, I mean, anybody makes breads anymore. I mean, it's just wonderful how convenient Indian food is. And that's true in India too. Because, you know, people used to have joint families. You'd have the daughter-in-laws, the daughters, and there'd be a lot of people doing labor. And now, you know, that's disappearing.
Dan said, are there any dishes served in Indian restaurants in Chicago that are distinctive or unique to Chicago or first made here?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if
You-
there's any dishes distinctive to New York or San Francisco, but that is certainly something to investigate.
It's almost like you need an Indian who's fresh from, who comes here and looks at things and go, what the heck is this? You know, what's strange? Because you wouldn't identify. Well, I don't know if you would, but I would. But I have heard, a lot of like the grocery stores had a lot of frozen Indian food, and it was really to serve the bachelors who had come here without family. Uh, And then I heard where there's sort of a cottage industry in India where mom will make her favorite or that child's favorite dish, bring it to somebody who will then vacuum pack it in such a way that it will pass US customs.
Oh,
Are you
there's so
aware?
much, yeah, smuggling food going in. Oh, you know, one thing that's interesting though, these restaurants in Devon, they have meal plans. So for like a certain amount of money a month, you can every day they'll make a meal for you, and they have it in a bag, and you go and pick it up. So this is great for students and for taxi drivers and for these bachelors. And I was really surprised. A lot of them have it now.
Because I remember, like, Hyderabad House was pretty exclusively Pakistani Indian taxi drivers. I mean, they even have a nicer place across the street. So when I've
Yeah.
shown up by myself, they try to get me to go across the street. I'm like, no, no, I'll stay here. They
No,
would
we go
prefer
there.
I.
And there's quite a few of these places on these little, not on Devon, but on these little side streets off Devon. And they have very odd hours. Like they're open from like 6 o'clock to 4 o'clock in the morning. And then they kind of close. Like one day we were with some friends and we thought we'd go for dinner. It was about 5:30 or so, but nobody was ready for dinner then because you know, they serve people who, like as you said, taxi drivers and things like that. So if you go at 2 o'clock in the morning, you can get a meal, but not if you go like at 2 in the afternoon. And the food's pretty good in these places, actually.
Jody said there are also tiffin services.
Here in Chicago, or
Yes.
yeah, probably. That's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And then if you okay, so um for a long time I would follow Ramadan. I mean, follow what was going on Devon Avenue during Ramadan.
Hmm.
And the biggest thing was not so much the dinner, that was easy to identify. It was the suhoor, the breakfast, because I
Oh
didn't
yeah,
understand the definition of sunrise. Because I thought if I showed up and the sun hadn't gone over, that was like fine. No, it was nautical sunrise, which is an hour and a half, 2 hours before.
really early.
That's when they shut down.
Yeah, I had the same thing happen to me. Yeah.
It took me years to break the code. Um, there was a very popular place with taxi drivers just south of Devon. You recall the name, Jose? I guess not. Um, well, there were popular. I don't know if they're still there, but there were some places, like Bubba's Palace and such, on Orleans
Yes.
downtown.
Yeah.
He said on Ridge.
Oh, that was Bismillah. But unfortunately, oh, it was so good. And I don't know why it closed. It was there forever. They had their own oven and it was just wonderful. And then he decided to open like a white tablecloth place in Devon and it just didn't work. I mean, and because parking in Devon is so terrible. I mean, that's the big bottleneck to going there often. Like
That and
I
go
go
ahead.
shopping. I go like at 8:30. I go really early in the morning and do shopping.
Yeah, well, I I think you're probably right about that. Um, and then you've commented that the suburbs is really where the food is now.
Yeah, to
You
some
get
degree. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Any other thoughts, people? Um, okay, as an Indian, the best Indian food in North America I have enjoyed was in Vancouver.
Oh, there's some famous places there. Yeah.
Okay.
Vidge especially is very famous. VIJ. I don't know if he's still around, but
And if people are curious, you should not drive there to Devon Avenue. The 155 bus from the Red Line, Loyola Station, runs 20 hours a day.
oh, well.
And Harpinder said Vidge is still around.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Well, somebody said a big thank you for such a detailed examination of Southeast Asian history. Do you have anything more you'd like to add or anybody?
No,
Oh,
thank you so much for these comments. No, I mean, this is what hope that people would tell me these. And there's a couple of things that I really need to follow out. So thanks a lot for this.
Dan said there's new things in the suburbs, but in the city too. A friend opened Basant during COVID on West Byron. Some
Hmm.
traditional food and progressive dishes too.
Yeah, I've got to try Basant. I haven't been there.
And then there's that new Indian restaurant in Highland Park.
Right, that we have to go to at some point.
Yes, I heard they were on WGN this morning, the program that begins at 10 a.m.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'll try to find the link for you.
Oh, okay.
Um, but they said that restaurant holds 85 people, which
Hmm.
is quite substantial. Maybe the Highland Park Historical Society might have a dinner there one of these days. Um, Let me read. There's been a few things going through while we were chatting. Um, Vidge had another restaurant called My Shanty, has recently shut down.
Oh.
Shireen Ahmad said try Kama Bistro too. Great talk, thanks.
Yep, I've been there years ago in the suburbs. I think they just opened, so not recently.
Okay. Peggy Wolf said Devon Avenue is like the UN. I tend to agree.
Yeah.
And somebody said they've commented Jose tried a couple of restaurants in DuPage County.
Naperville there's a nice restaurant in Naperville that a friend of mine runs called Indian Harvest. Oh my gosh. And they have, it's really elegant. Um, I think it's on Army Trail Road, but there's a lot of nice restaurants in the suburbs now.
Oh yeah, definitely. Definitely. I'm just waiting. Is there any more comments? If not, we'll just kind of wind this down. Colleen, it was fun. And of course, we're going to be getting together with Colleen one of these days, um, and have another Indian restaurant a little bit off the beaten path in the sense of the menu, not so much the location.
No, we, okay.
Though for some people, going to the city is off the beaten path. For others, going into the suburbs is off the beaten path. So we just have to pick our poison. Somebody just mentioned Coach House 2. I don't know anything about it. Where's Coach House, by the way?
Okay, well, thanks a lot.
It's a formal fixed menu. Okay. All right. Well, we'll cover this another day. And thank you. And if you have more comments, you can email me and I will forward them on to Colleen if
Great,
that
thank you.
works. Okie doke. Thanks,
Thank you.
Colleen. Happy New Year.
Okay, see you soon. Bye.
All right. Bye bye.